That's a tough act to follow. But I think this last session promises to be perhaps the highlight of today. Good afternoon, everybody. And those of you who are leaving, I think you should come back very shortly because this does happen to be the best session. My name is Ganesh Natarajan. I'm with Mindcrest. And first of all, I'd like to thank Scott and his team for a fantastic conference. I think we've all learned a lot as we've gone along. And perhaps we'll put it to good use in our own respective worlds. I'd also like to thank Bloomberg for a fantastic 10-year relationship with Mindcrest, and I hope to be here 10 years from now. When George Heffron, who's here, and I started my company in 2001, 16 years ago, admittedly, we really had no idea of what we were doing. But coming from big law firms, there was one thing we knew, that there was a range of legal services that required a very different approach. So our philosophy is to bring the best people, the best technology, and the best processes together to provide innovative solutions to our clients and give our clients an exceptional experience. With offices in North America, Europe, and Asia, we service our clients in litigation support, compliance management, contracts management, and legal analytics, which is what we do for Bloomberg. So thank you again for joining us today. The Russians are coming, and they're hacking everything in sight. Or is it the Chinese? Maybe the North Koreans? Or is it some overweight guy sitting in his pajamas on a bed hacking us? But needless to say, this is the topic for today. This is what all of us are concerned about, whether we are in this room, at work, or at home. It is certainly part and pervasive across our lives. And to set the stage for us, to create the right context, and to bring the latest news that we have around cybersecurity and security risks, let me welcome first Lauren Kiel, Director of Editorial Programming at Bloomberg BNA Plus, and fresh from the newsroom, Winnie O'Kelly, who is the Executive Editor of Bloomberg News. Please welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ganesh. So, Russians, Chinese, guys in pajamas. Winnie O'Kelly is here with us. She's the executive editor of Bloomberg News. She covers everything legal from the courts to the bad guys. You want to give us a quick overview of what you cover and what you've been working on?
Well, we cover the courts around the world. We also cover enforcement matters, which many of you are very familiar with. We cover private lawsuits. We have had a busy day. We've been writing about everything from a hedge fund who was getting information early, apparently, from folks in D.C. to trade on healthcare news, to a BNP settlement of a long-running investigation with the government, to what Deutsche Bank is about to do on mirror trading. So it covers a pretty wide gamut.
Great. So our next session is going to focus on cyber vulnerabilities. So a couple of ones we've been hearing in the news lately. Obviously, the inquiry into what happened with the U.S. elections last year. So update us. What do we know? What happened? What do we know so far?
Okay, despite what some people say, we do know that Russia was behind it. Can we all agree on that? We don't know all the details because the report that was put out by the government intentionally kept a lot of things in the dark, and that was to preserve how information was collected. I do think we will have more information on that over time. What we don't know is whether anybody else was involved and to what degree. At this point, as we all know, there are inquiries going on, starting with our new special counsel, Mueller, who is formerly the FBI, to determine whether anyone in the Trump campaign or any of his aides were attempted to recruited or were involved in any way. Did it amount to collusion? I'd point out that there's another thing that kind of gets overlooked a lot in all of this, and that is the efforts the government went to try to prevent our election from being compromised in any way. So I actually wrote down the name of it because I knew I'd forget the name of it. It's the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. That was created on the eve of the election, and the idea was that all the states would share information, and they would share it with the federal government under auspices of things like Homeland Security, so we could see what was going on. And there were two things they were looking for. One was tampering potentially with voter registrations, and the other was with reporting up from the county levels as the ballots and totals get moved up. From, I would say, every bit of information we have so far, there was no attempt to change any numbers or any numbers of votes. However, there were attempts to tamper with voter registrations. And some of that came out early in the campaign, and I think a lot of that hasn't yet come to light. During the primaries, Illinois figured out, for example, that there were attempts to breach its computer system to get at voter registrations. And it was able to do so because it saw things that other states were seeing. So that's the kind of collaborative effort that can make a difference. And I think you should stay close attention to that. There's probably going to be more on that front.
Great. And so do we think like Washington is going to be better prepared to deal with this in the future? Do you see political will that's moving to change this and prevent this in future elections?
Well, that's a really complicated question, right? What we do know is the Russians are getting smarter and better and trying new techniques. We can see what's going on in Europe. But we can also see, from what we've seen in France and Germany so far, is that the very public nature of what happened here in the U.S. has helped with the defenses and the preparation. It seems to, and again, it seems to have had less of an effect on those elections. So potentially, right, as we make it more public, as we kind of go along, and government spending more, there's definitely an effort to do more, but the tricks are getting smarter at every single turn.
The other one we've heard about in the news lately was the WannaCry ransomware attack that affected the NHS and other groups across the world. Update us on what we know on that one so far.
Okay, so this one seemed to have a really uneven impact, right? Russia and China were hit disproportionately hard, as was the UK health system. The most recent reports, although it hasn't been definitively said by our government, is that North Korea is behind it. And that's because it bears many similarities to some of the hacks we've seen before. The Bangladesh central bank hack, the Sony hack. There are, fingerprints inside these systems that they can track down. And that is where that's coming from. So that's what the belief is. What do we know about, how it was done? Well, we know that supposedly this was a zero-day, as they call it, tool that was stockpiled by the NSA that somehow got out. So this goes back to your basic question of, are we prepared? What is the government going to do to secure those things going forward? Is there a better way to lock them down? And that has always been the fear, that if you stockpile what we call exploits, right? These are tools that can be used to conduct essentially cyber war. What happens if they get out into the mainstream?
So talk to me about the private sector. Where are we seeing cyber threats showing up in corporate environments?
I think the question is, where are we not, right? It started off in things like maybe the financial system. We saw things, maybe one of the earliest ones that we spent a lot of time on here at Bloomberg was the Target hack, which had a really profound impact. I mean, that led to major changes at the company, in part because they didn't have the level of preparation that they probably should have, and they had trouble responding to it as well as they should have. Now we've gone on to see Russia and China, and a number of them. I was just trying to remember. There's been so many. I'm like, oh, well, forget them all. Let me jot down a few here. So you've got North Korea, now the central banks, not just Bangladesh, but others, and Sony. With Russia, we've got Yahoo, that huge hack, and the financial companies, quite a few of those. Russia and China both have been placing exploits into utilities, and that's where they've implanted things that could be used at a later date. So that's just some of it. We've also seen things like PR Newswire, remember, where you could try to find ways to, this could be commercial hacks. This isn't necessarily for nation state. This could be for commercial purposes, where you can get into a system, get information in advance, information that could be market moving, and use it to profit at the expense of others.
So you mentioned a number of industries there: retail, entertainment,
Yep.
news, you name it. Are there certain
Healthcare.
industries that are particularly vulnerable, or more that we think are going to move to be more vulnerable?
Well, I think they'll continue to find ways to hit just about everybody. I mean, think about the recent Google Doc worm, right? How many of you had that? Did you get bombarded with the Google Docs? My favorite is one of my reporters who is the expert on this, right? He got one from his child's daycare center or whatever as part of this. And he opened the file because he couldn't wait to see the new pictures from his kid, right, at the new daycare center. Luckily, he didn't click through. But if someone like that, who is so well trained, he only works with encryption, he spends all of his time doing this. If someone like that can be vulnerable, I think it's most everything. But where we look for the biggest problems, perhaps, are places where privacy is an issue, where information can be gathered for all kinds of purposes. So we always think about healthcare and finance as being particularly vulnerable. But social networks carry a lot of that same information. They know where you're traveling and when. They know information about your families. And that, too, could be really painful. In the government hacks we've seen, where China and Russia and others have gotten into large databases to try to get information, it is presumed a good deal of that is to basically we call it compromat, right? Or to find ways to maybe blackmail or to embed yourselves with people who work for the government or even suppliers for the government who then might feel they have to provide information. So it really goes across a very wide spectrum. In Europe, probably, you have particular vulnerabilities because that's where laws make it easier to go after companies if they weren't well prepared, or the regulations. So we're going to see more of it there.
So as you and your reporters are working on these issues, what concerns you the most? What's surprising you the most right now?
I think the speed of it, right? And I was talking to someone, she's a CISA for a large company. I won't say it because that would make her very unhappy, but we were talking about the ransomware attack, and she'd just come off of a couple of rough weeks. And she said, yeah, we hear there's another wave coming in early June. And I said, well, what do you hear, right? Is it going to be, some variation? Because we don't know. But they're sort of still trying to clean up, but they're also buckling down. And it's very hard to prepare for these things. And even though they've become more commonplace, so in a way there's a little less impact, it's still very, very painful. A company will tell you, we were at the Freedom of the Press dinner last night. I hope some of you were there. A lot of lawyers were present, and they do good work. A lawyer there who's a general counsel who has been hacked and dealt with a few times. I said, what advice would you give to others? And he said, well, first off, you better very quickly get your IT team in there, and you better very quickly figure out if you've got a privacy issue. In other words, if consumer data has been breached in some way, because that's what really exposes you to a lot of litigation or regulatory problems. That's one of your first things to do. And you better be upfront about it. Now, the other thing that surprised him, and he kept saying it to me, was, you think this is going to be weeks? It's going to be months or years before you're going to get your head above water on it. So you need to understand that going in. And that's true. The thing that surprises me probably is the speed with which other countries are getting these kinds of sophisticated exploits and tools. When I first started editing a lot of stories on the subject maybe 4 years ago, there were only 2 or 3 countries that were considered to be super sophisticated in this space. And that's expanding very, very rapidly. Someone just mentioned Turkey to me as another one who could be behind something like WannaCry. The other thing that's really shocking and difficult to deal with is what we call blended attacks, which is where they could be trying to do something for both criminal purposes and for state-sponsored purposes, and it's very hard to tell the difference, and they could both be going on at the same time. So if you're a company, some of the information that's being taken from your systems might look like it's just for some ransomware, right? You pay them a few bucks and all is good. But it could also be another government has also embedded itself in there for other purposes entirely. And that may come as a secondary surprise and shock to people.
Great, and we'll have to leave it there. Winnie O'Kelly from Bloomberg News, thank you so much.
Sure.
Please welcome Pete Bashar, the EVP and General Counsel for Marsh & McLellan Companies, and Ari Maharis, the FBI Special Agent in Charge, Special Operations Cyber Division, New York office, for our next conversation. Thank you all.